Have you ever noticed something strange about history's greatest minds? From Socrates hearing voices to Tesla's bizarre obsessions, from Van Gogh's hallucinations to Einstein's eccentric behaviors. There's a pattern here that's too consistent to ignore. What if I told you that the most brilliant visionaries throughout history weren't brilliant despite their madness, but because of it? That what we label as crazy might actually be the doorway to genius? This idea isn't just some romantic notion about the tortured artist. It's a profound psychological insight that Carl Jung uncovered through his work with both normal people and those society deemed insane. And understanding this connection between genius and madness might completely change how you see human potential, including your own. I first encountered this idea when reading about Jung's own brushes with what most would call madness. After his painful break with Freud, Jung went through what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period where he deliberately allowed himself to descend into what looked like psychosis. He heard voices, had visions, and documented strange symbolic experiences that would have earned most people a psychiatric diagnosis. But Jung wasn't losing his mind. He was exploring it. He was venturing into the depths of the unconscious mind, regions that most people never access because we're taught from childhood to stay within the safe boundaries of conventional thinking. What Jung discovered during this period became the foundation for much of his life's work. He realized that the unconscious mind isn't just a dumping ground for repressed desires and forgotten memories. It's a vast reservoir of wisdom, creativity, and untapped human potential. The problem is that accessing this reservoir requires crossing boundaries that society labels as crazy. Think about it. Our normal, everyday consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg. Below the surface lies the personal unconscious with its repressed memories and desires. But even deeper lies what Jung called the collective unconscious, the shared inheritance of human psychological experience stretching back to our earliest ancestors. This collective unconscious speaks a language that our rational minds don't understand. It communicates through symbols, myths, and emotions rather than linear logic. When someone begins to access this level of consciousness, they often appear crazy by conventional standards because they're experiencing reality in a radically different way than the consensus reality we're all supposed to share. I remember reading about the mathematician John Nash, whose story was told in A Beautiful Mind. Nash made groundbreaking contributions to game theory and differential geometry while experiencing what was diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenia. His mind was operating on multiple levels simultaneously, levels that most of us never access. Or consider Nikola Tesla, who claimed to receive his most brilliant ideas through vivid visions. He could visualize complex machinery in perfect detail, watching it operate in his mind before building a single component. Was Tesla mentally ill? Or was he accessing levels of perception that most of us can't reach? Jung's insight was revolutionary. What we call genius often involves the ability to access the deeper layers of the unconscious mind and bring its contents back into conscious awareness in a form that others can understand. But this journey between worlds comes at a price that looks a lot like madness to the outside observer. Let me share something I experienced personally that gave me a tiny glimpse of what Jung was talking about. Years ago, I participated in an intensive meditation retreat. After 5 days of silence and 10 hours of daily meditation, something strange happened. The boundaries between my thoughts and the external world began to blur. I could physically feel other people's emotions. Time became elastic. The separation between me and not me started dissolving. Was I going crazy? By conventional standards, maybe. But I was also experiencing a profound sense of interconnection and access to insights that weren't available to my normal consciousness. It was like briefly visiting another level of reality, one that artists, mystics, and visionaries throughout history have described. Of course, I returned to normal consciousness after the retreat ended, but that brief experience helped me understand something about the nature of genius and madness. They're both states where the usual boundaries of consciousness have shifted. Jung observed that many of history's greatest creative and intellectual breakthroughs came from people who lived in this borderland between conventional sanity and what society calls madness. These individuals could move between different levels of consciousness, bringing back treasures from the depths that transformed our collective understanding. Look at William Blake, whose visionary poetry and art came from what he described as direct communication with angels and spirits. Blake's contemporaries thought he was insane. Today, we recognize him as a profound artistic genius whose work anticipated psychological insights that were centuries ahead of his time. Or consider Friedrich Nietzsche, whose philosophical insights were unmatched in their depth and originality. Nietzsche spent the last decade of his life in what appeared to be complete madness. But was it coincidence that his most brilliant work came during the period when he was already beginning to experience the symptoms of what would later be diagnosed as neurosyphilis? Or was his illness breaking down the barriers between conscious and unconscious, giving him access to insights that more sane minds couldn't reach? Jung saw that genius and madness aren't opposites. They're points on a spectrum of how permeable the boundary is between conscious and unconscious. The average person has a strong barrier that keeps unconscious material under control. The psychotic person has a barrier that's too weak, allowing unconscious material to flood consciousness without integration. The genius has a permeable barrier that allows movement between the worlds, but with some degree of control and the ability to translate what they find into forms others can understand. This insight changes everything about how we might view both genius and mental illness. What if the crazy person isn't broken, but overwhelmed by contact with levels of reality their conscious mind can't integrate? What if the genius isn't superhuman, but simply someone who can dance back and forth across the boundary between worlds? I've worked with people diagnosed with various forms of mental illness, and I've been struck by how often their delusions contain profound symbolic truths. Even if taken literally, they seem absurd. The person who believes they're receiving radio transmissions from another dimension might be experiencing a real connection to the collective unconscious, but lacking the framework to interpret it symbolically rather than literally. Jung noticed this pattern in his psychiatric work. He found that the seemingly nonsensical ravings of psychotic patients often contained the same symbolic patterns found in ancient myths, religious visions, and alchemical texts, even when the patients had no exposure to these sources. They weren't making up random delusions. They were experiencing raw contact with the collective unconscious without the psychological tools to integrate it. The difference between the psychotic and the visionary might not be what they experience, but how they relate to and integrate those experiences. Think of it like this. Imagine consciousness as a house with many floors. Most people live their entire lives on the ground floor, occasionally venturing to the basement, the personal unconscious, to retrieve forgotten memories or deal with repressed emotions. The psychotic person suddenly finds all the floors of the house open at once, with no way to navigate between them. They're overwhelmed by perceptions and insights from multiple levels simultaneously, with no map to make sense of the experience. The genius, by contrast, knows how to move between floors. They can venture into the depths and heights of the house, but they maintain enough orientation to find their way back and to create maps for others. They bring back discoveries that transform our understanding of the ground floor reality most people inhabit. This understanding of genius helps explain why so many exceptional minds throughout history have struggled with the mental health. They're paying the price for access to levels of perception that most people never reach. Vincent van Gogh created paintings of such emotional intensity that they still move viewers to tears more than a century later. While experiencing episodes of psychosis so severe, he cut off his own ear. Would he have created such transformative art if his perception hadn't extended beyond normal consciousness? Carl Jung himself wrote, "Be grateful for your difficulties and challenges, for they hold blessings." In fact, man needs difficulties. They are necessary for health, personal growth, individuation, and self-actualization. What Jung recognized is that the journey into the deeper layers of the psyche, the journey that both the genius and the psychotic undertake, is inherently dangerous. But it's also the source of everything new and transformative in human experience. The genius is someone who journeys into the unconscious and returns with treasure. The psychotic is someone who gets lost in the journey. But both are explorers of the same territory, a territory most normal people never enter. This doesn't mean we should romanticize mental illness or the genuine suffering it causes. But it does suggest we might need to rethink our understanding of both genius and madness. What if these conditions aren't opposite ends of a spectrum, but different outcomes of the same fundamental process? The process of crossing the boundary between conscious and unconscious. Jung's own life demonstrates this dynamic. During his confrontation with the unconscious, he maintained his professional practice and family life while systematically exploring states of consciousness that by conventional standards would be considered psychotic. He later wrote, "I was on my way to discovering my own myth. The task was to find the myth that shaped me." This is critical to understanding Jung's view of genius. The exceptional mind isn't creating something entirely new. Rather, they're discovering patterns and possibilities that already exist in the collective unconscious, but haven't yet been brought into conscious awareness. The mathematical insights of Ramanujan, the musical compositions of Mozart, the scientific discoveries of Einstein. These weren't invented from nothing. They were discovered by minds that could access levels of the unconscious, where these patterns already existed in potential form. This is why genuine genius often has a quality of revelation or discovery, rather than mere invention. The creator themselves often feels they are receiving rather than creating. Mozart described how entire compositions would come to him complete, needing only to be written down. Einstein's breakthroughs came through visual thought experiments and intuitive leaps, not just rational calculation. Jung would say these geniuses were accessing the archetypes of the collective unconscious, universal patterns that structure human experience and perception. The more deeply one can access these archetypes, the more profound the creative output, but also the greater the risk to psychological stability. This is the price of genius that Jung identified. To venture beyond the boundaries of conventional consciousness is to risk madness. The deeper you go, the greater the risk. I've seen this in my work with highly creative people. Those with the most exceptional gifts often struggle the most with maintaining psychological balance. Their access to deeper layers of consciousness is both their greatest strength and their greatest vulnerability. One artist I worked with described it perfectly. It's like living with a door in your mind that most people keep locked. Mine keeps swinging open. Amazing things come through that door. Visions, ideas, connections nobody else sees. But sometimes, terrifying things come through too. I can't close the door without losing the gifts. But leaving it open means I'm always at risk. This is exactly what Jung was talking about. The exceptional mind lives with a more permeable boundary between conscious and unconscious. This permeability enables genius, but also creates vulnerability. So, what can we learn from Jung's insights about genius and madness? First, perhaps we should be more humble about the boundaries of normal consciousness. What we consider sane may simply be conventional, the agreed upon reality that lets us function in society, but also limits what we can perceive and understand. Second, maybe we should reconsider how we view those who experience reality differently. The person diagnosed with bipolar disorder might be struggling with the same permeable boundaries that enable creative genius. The schizophrenic might be overwhelmed by symbolic content from the collective unconscious that they lack the tools to integrate. Jung wasn't suggesting that all mental illness is misunderstood genius, but he was suggesting that both genius and certain forms of mental illness involve access to levels of consciousness beyond ordinary awareness. This view challenges the strict medical model that sees mental differences purely as chemical imbalances or brain dysfunction. Jung would argue that while biological factors certainly play a role, the content of psychological experiences matters. Even psychotic experiences contain meaning and potential wisdom. I think of a client I worked with who was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. During manic episodes, he would have profound insights about the interconnected nature of reality that later proved to align with advanced concepts in systems theory and quantum physics. Despite having no formal training in these areas, was he just crazy? Or was he accessing knowledge from deeper layers of consciousness in an unintegrated way? Jung would say that both interpretations contain truth. The exceptional mind is exceptional precisely because it can move between different levels of reality. But this movement comes with risks. The history of human innovation bears this out. From Pythagoras to Beethoven, from Blake to Einstein, from Tesla to Jobs. Exceptional creativity often comes with psychological patterns that wouldn't be considered normal. The price of genius is living at the edge of conventional sanity. But Jung's perspective offers something more hopeful than just the stereotype of the mad genius. He suggests that with proper understanding and integration, it's possible to access the depths without being overwhelmed by them. Jung himself is the perfect example. He ventured deep into what most would consider madness, documented his experiences in his Red Book, and returned to create a body of work that transformed our understanding of human psychology. He didn't avoid the unconscious depths to stay sane. He developed methods to explore those depths while maintaining his orientation. This is perhaps the most valuable insight for anyone with a creative or innovative mind. The goal isn't to avoid the depths to stay safe in convention. The goal is to develop the psychological strength and tools to venture into the depths and return with treasure. Jung developed many such tools: active imagination, dream analysis, symbolic understanding, that help navigate the unconscious without being overwhelmed by it. These practices allow for exploration beyond the boundaries of conventional consciousness while maintaining enough structure for integration. I think this is why Jung's ideas resonate so deeply with creative people. He doesn't pathologize the permeable boundaries that enable creativity. He offers ways to work with them productively. The genius, in Jung's view, isn't someone who is immune to madness. The genius is someone who can dance with madness, venturing into the same waters that drown others, but finding a way to swim rather than sink. This perspective might completely transform how we understand both exceptional creativity and psychological suffering. Perhaps they aren't opposite conditions, but different outcomes of the same fundamental human capacity: the ability to access levels of consciousness beyond the conventional. The next time you encounter someone whose mind works differently, whether they're labeled genius or mentally ill, remember Jung's insight. They might not be broken or superior. They might simply be experiencing the consequences of a more permeable boundary between conscious and unconscious. And if you yourself have experienced states of consciousness beyond the ordinary, whether through creative inspiration, spiritual experience, or psychological crisis, know that you're not alone. You're part of a lineage of human minds that have ventured beyond conventional boundaries, sometimes at great personal cost. The wisest people in history understood that what we call sanity is just one narrow band on the spectrum of possible human consciousness. True wisdom often requires the courage to venture beyond that band, to risk being called crazy for the sake of bringing back insights from beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. As Jung himself put it, "Show me a sane man, and I will cure him for you." Perhaps what looked like madness in history's greatest minds wasn't a flaw, but a feature, the necessary consequence of minds that refuse to be confined by the limitations of conventional consciousness. The price of genius, in Jung's view, isn't something to fear, but something to understand. Only by acknowledging the risks of venturing beyond conventional consciousness can we fully appreciate the courage of those whose minds have expanded our collective understanding. And perhaps, in that understanding, we might find more compassion, both for those struggling with psychological suffering and more appreciation for the price paid by those whose exceptional minds have transformed our world. Because ultimately, to be fully human might mean accepting that the boundary between genius and madness isn't as clear as we'd like to believe, and that our greatest collective treasures have often come from those willing to risk crossing it.